There is, because geographers are self-conscious and because maps are objective, there has grown up around the idea of the atlas. The idea of the atlas is this objective portrayal of reality as it really is, and that's all it is. It doesn't do anything else. And that's, nonsense. If you look at any atlas, except for these recently crowdsourced atlases, if you look at any atlas, you'll see that it's promoting a theory, it's promoting a point of view, it's promoting an argument of some kind, it's making a case. It's making a case that we're in the center of the world, or someplace else is in the center of the world, that the world is structured in a certain kind of way. It's telling a story of some kind, but it's not upfront about it. And I wanted this thing to be upfront about it. This was going to be a narrative atlas of Ulin Heights, the neighborhood that I lived in, and it was going to tell a story about Ulin Heights through the means of the maps. So, in fact, it says maps for a narrative atlas. This is not the narrative atlas. These are a collection of maps for the narrative atlas. The narrative atlas will never be finished, probably, but
well, the narrative atlas would, like Mercator's atlas, have to be this enormous sort of endless process, right? Because as another point that I think you make, which is a really interesting point, is that maps are they become obsolete almost instantly because they capture a moment in time. They capture a place at a particular moment. As that changes, you talk about in Ulin Heights that in 1982 you could lie out in the middle of Ulin Avenue and to map the night sky, whereas 30 years later, with the changing traffic patterns, that would no longer be possible.
Well, you read that book.
That's my job.
Yeah,
you don't want to be interviewed by a guy who hasn't read your book.
No. I'm impressed, though. It's true. Maps capture some moment. They're made at a time, and they are of that time that they're made. I don't care if they're pretending to be of some other time, of the future or the past or something. They're of the time that they're made, and they incorporate stuff of that time. And most maps, in fact, are of a particular time. They're not about the future or about, well, I shouldn't say that. There are so many maps about the future this day, and there are so many maps about fictional places, and there are so many maps about the past. But they have the thumbprint of, 2013 on them if they're made right now. There wasn't a theory of neighborhoods. Neighborhoods had this ill-defined, we all know what a neighborhood is. The idea of defining a neighborhood is ridiculous, except that it's not, as it turns out for certain geographers. There's this one guy, Leonard Bowden, this is a great article. He said neighborhoods are the property of 11-year-old pre-adolescent males. They're the ones who create neighborhoods. They tie these people together in these networks. When they go to junior high school, they start dealing with a larger part of the environment than their neighborhood. When they're too young, they're too confined. So he figured it was 11-year-old, not females, although they'd probably work today, because when he wrote the article, females were not allowed to just wander around like.
So it was sort of the roaming radius.
It was the roaming radius of a group of boys, and I read that and I was like, wow. This makes sense to me. And I don't think it's the answer, but it made a lot more sense to me than the Chicago school, let's divide the city up into socioeconomic areas or census tract data or any of that kind of stuff. And it turned out there really isn't a useful theory about neighborhoods. And so one of the things we wanted to do with the Atlas was grapple with this idea. What is a neighborhood? How does it work? What does it do? What does a neighborhood do? I mean, if it's a real thing, it has to do something. If you're looking at these pumpkins, these pumpkins were picked up by somebody and they just picked this part of it right here and they thought that was important and they thought this wasn't important. But the whole thing's important because this is the top of the hill and that's where the pumpkins are. And this is the bottom of the hill and they don't do pumpkins. Or they didn't do pumpkins. I'm sure they all do pumpkins now. But they didn't do pumpkins. And this reflects precisely the property values. And so there's a map of property values. There's a map of mentions in the newsletter. There still is a newsletter, and I just went through the first 10 years of the newsletter and did a content analysis of all the addresses and mapped that.
And the newsletter is basically a community association.
Yeah, community association newsletter. It came out once a month, and during this time it came out once a month. And the people who are mentioned in the newsletter, a cluster at the top of the hill, and down here there are people who are never mentioned, addresses that never come up in the newsletter. And so, you know, you look at these things together and you begin to get a real sense of what it's like to actually live there. At the top of the hill, there are rich people who put pumpkins on their porch.
Well, it's interesting too in terms of the newsletter, because you talk about actual street addresses, and what is it? The street address that is most mentioned in the newsletter going back ends up being the same street address that the mayor ultimately moves into.
Yeah, the same, 3 people lived in it across this mapping period. 3 people lived in this. Is always the most mentioned. So it's like the house attracts the person who's going to be this kind of individual in the neighborhood.